Every living thing has certain requirements. The details of the requirements may vary, but even the hardiest and most tenacious of organisms still have at least a few basic needs. It is difficult to envision a group of multicellular organisms more resilient than the often overlooked lichens. Though some species are quite delicate and require very specific and hospitable environments, others are capable of thriving on little more than a barren piece of rock. Some lichens can be found living on exposed rock in Antarctica, and it is difficult to envision a more inhospitable place to live. Still, lichens have their needs, simple and humble though they may be. It is interesting to see just how they go about obtaining what little they require, and why they can thrive where most life would simply wither away. To begin with, a lichen consists of at least two very different forms of life that are deeply intertwined. One component is a fungus, most often an ascomycete of some kind. The other component is photosynthetic and is usually a form of microscopic green algae. There are cases of lichens that use cyanobacteria instead, and sometimes both types of photosynthesizer are found together in the same lichen. Regardless of the details, the general pattern is as follows. The fungal component forms the overall structure of the lichen and binds it to whatever surface it might be growing on. It also provides a protected environment for the algal component. The algal component generates organic molecules by photosynthesis and supplies them to the fungal component. Mineral needs are most often met by rainwater and the occasional dust particles. Most lichens have a fairly standard internal structure, though there are variations in the details. There is generally an outer cortex and an inner medulla, with the algal symbionts located somewhere between the two. There are a few major forms that lichens tend to take, though the exact categories are sometimes disputed. For our purposes, it is more than sufficient to consider three overall lichen forms. Some lichen species simply grow flat against a surface, and are sometimes referred to as crustose lichens or maybe encrusting lichens. Other species extend outward from the growing surface. Some of these form structures resembling stems or roots, which may branch into quite impressive tangles. These are often called fruticose lichens. Still other species form flattened leafy structures, and these are generally known as foliose lichens. Of these three groups, the foliose lichens may be considered to have the most complicated internal structure, at least overall. A typical foliose lichen may be simplified into a flattened structure consisting of 4 layers. There is an upper cortex, made up of fungal tissue that is fairly tightly woven together to form a barrier against the outside world. Beneath this is a layer of algal cells, and beneath these algal cells is a relatively thick medulla, made up of more loosely arranged fungal hyphae, the tubes of segmented cells that compose the tissues of typical multicellular fungi. Beneath this is a lower cortex, another layer of tightly woven fungal hyphae that may be quite different from the upper cortex. In some species, there are also root-like extensions from the lower cortex, known as rhizines. As with other forms of life, one thing that lichens absolutely require is water. However, this can be something of a problem depending on where they are growing. Of course, it's easy enough to have adequate water if you're clinging to a tree branch in a misty primeval forest. It's somewhat more troublesome if you're living on a rock in the middle of a desert. Even in the rainiest of forests, though, some days can still be rather dry. To make the problem all the worse, lichens aren't typically very large. A small body size means a relatively large amount of surface compared to the body's overall internal volume. As a result, they can lose water very easily and quite rapidly. It is common for plants to send roots into the underlying soil to obtain adequate water. Even typical mushrooms are merely outgrowths of an extensive underground network of fungal hyphae, so moisture isn't much of a problem for them either. Alas, for the lichens, it is a different story. Though some lichens can grow on soil or rotting stumps, others grow on surfaces that they can't readily send roots into in search of water. Even the lichens on the ground don't probe significantly into the underlying soil. They are also unable to move about in search of water sources, though it would be quite an amusing sight if they could. There might be something quite endearing about watching a bunch of frilly, fuzzy little clusters of lichens scuttling and scampering about the forest floor on a sunny afternoon. One strategy often seen in both plants and animals is a degree of waterproofing on the outer integument to reduce water losses. This is extremely common in terrestrial arthropods, which usually have a thin layer of wax over their exoskeletons. Similarly, most of the higher plants have some degree of waxy epidermal covering as well. Lichens, along with their common neighbors the bryophytes, take a rather different approach. They don't try to conserve water or retain it in their tissues. Instead, they allow themselves to dry out between rainy days. Such desiccation would be lethal to most forms of life. For the lichens, it is merely a temporary inconvenience. Life is essentially paused as the lichen's tissues enter a state of suspended animation. With the next rainfall, the normal life processes are resumed within a matter of seconds, and persist until the lichen dries out once more. This phenomenon is known as poikilohydry, and the aspiring biologist might recognize a similarity to the word poikilothermy. A rough translation for this word would be a changeable temperature. Put simply, a poikilotherm is a creature that has a body temperature roughly matching that of its surroundings. There are variations on this in actual practice, but the basic definition is sound enough. Similarly, the poikilohydric lichens have a water content that fluctuates with the wetness of their surroundings. A variable degree of hydration, in other words. This approach to life saves the lichen a great deal of trouble, as it simply waits out the dry spells. However, this does raise a new and rather daunting problem. Every lichen requires light for the photosynthetic processes of its algal component. Even in a shady forest understory, there is at least some light to be had during the day. This is just as well as it is a vital resource for anything that carries out photosynthesis. The trouble is, light is not merely an energy source for stitching together organic molecules. There is an old adage that it is possible to have too much of a good thing, and too much light can be quite damaging. Anybody who's ever experienced a sunburn can attest to this. Ultraviolet radiation tends to be rather rough on living tissues, having a propensity for damaging genetic material. Normally, this damage is counteracted by systems of repair enzymes, or prevented by pigments like melanin. However, the lichen has a problem. While it is dried out and in suspended animation, all of the life processes for a lichen are essentially paused. This includes the activities of any repair enzymes that might normally counteract the inevitable molecular damage of daylight. While ultraviolet light is certainly the most punishing form of radiation normally encountered on the Earth's surface, even blue and purple light can be surprisingly damaging in large enough doses. This is all the more true when a lichen must go for several days, weeks, or even months between hydrations. The obvious solution would be some form of protective pigmentation, but there is a problem here as well. While hydrated and metabolically active, the last thing a lichen needs is a bunch of pigment getting in the way of incoming visible light. As it turns out, the solution is surprisingly simple. To illustrate this solution, let us consider a common variety of lichen found in particularly sunny spots. The genus Xanthoria contains species that are typically either crustose or foliose. Colors range from pale yellow through deep golden hues, vibrant shades of orange, and even red in a few of the more extreme cases. The yellow-orange color is due to a pigment found in the upper cortex of this lichen called parietin. It is named for the species Xanthoria parietina. This species name roughly translates into yellow thing on the wall, and this lichen is often found growing on the outer walls of various structures. Parietin is a fairly large, complicated molecule that absorbs ultraviolet light. This alone would make it effective as a sunblock, but it also absorbs blue light, conferring even greater protection. As it turns out, when one removes blue light from a typical sunlight spectrum, what remains is some variation of yellow or orange, thus the color of the lichen. Under the microscope, one can see the deep yellow hue of the upper cortex in a dried Xanthoria sample. Just beneath this is a dark green layer of dormant algal cells. As with other lichens, when this lichen is hydrated, the tissues expand as they temporarily fill with water. This expansion separates the unified yellow of the upper cortex into several distinct yellow spots, with patches of clear tissue between them. The effect is quite similar to opening the blinds on a window, allowing light to pass between the clusters of protective sunblock to reach the underlying algal layer. This little alteration of tissue structure can be seen as a rapid and fairly remarkable change in hue. A dormant patch of Xanthoria might be a warm amber color while dry. Adding water will almost immediately result in a patch of yellowish-green lichen. Other species might turn from pale brown to deep olive, or ghastly white to vibrant teal. Regardless of the details, when the lichen dries out again, the proverbial blinds are closed once more, and the protective pigments once again shield the algal cells from excessive solar radiation. There is an interesting quirk to many of these pigments as part of their protective function. Simply absorbing high-energy ultraviolet light would rapidly lead to the destruction of the molecular structure of these pigments. The solution to this issue is to absorb the high-energy photons and then immediately emit somewhat lower-energy photons along with a bit of heat. These fluorescent phenomena are typically drowned out by the brightness of daylight, but it is possible to see them under certain conditions. If a lichen sample is brought into a dark room and placed under an ultraviolet lamp, it is quite easy to observe the almost unearthly glow of the protective pigments. The precise colors will vary depending on the blend of pigments found in a given lichen species. Some species will glow a deep purple, while others will glow a lurid greenish hue, and still others emit a sort of neon blue light. The parietin in Xanthoria gives off a warm red glow with touches of orange and pink, depending on the sample. Pigments can be used by lichens in a somewhat more underhanded fashion as well. This can be seen in the genus Parmelia. Members of this genus are pale foliose lichens, with upper surfaces that are nearly white, with perhaps a touch of bluish or greenish gray. They tend to take on bright shades of teal and cerulean when hydrated, which can give them a rather pleasing aesthetic. Still, Parmelia has a darker side to it, quite literally. While the upper cortex is pale, the lower cortex is very nearly black. In strong light, it might appear as a very dark shade of brown. In addition, the lower cortex is densely endowed with little root-like rhizines, which help to anchor the lichen in place as it spreads out over a growing surface. The overall effect can be rather unsettling up close, as the gentle pallor of the upper surface conceals a dark underbelly complete with tentacles just barely visible at the edges. The pigment here is a form of melanin, not unlike that seen in many animal species. Melanin, as one might guess by its exceptionally dark color, is very good at absorbing visible light as well as ultraviolet light. One might reasonably wonder why a lichen would have a light-absorbing pigment underneath all of its other tissues, including the photosynthetic algae. There is the possibility that this pigmentation would catch any light that got past the algal cells and convert it into heat, providing a slight boost to metabolism on cold days. However, there is a somewhat more ruthless explanation that seems at least as probable. As much as lichens require light and water, they also require space. They need a surface to grow on. Parmelia tends to grow outward along a surface, spreading and creeping as it sets down new rhizines to hold it securely in place. Now suppose that the surface in question already has a population of lichens present. Let's say crustose lichens closely adhering to the surface and all but impossible to dislodge. As the Parmelia grows, it would spread out over these neighboring lichens. In so doing, its black lower cortex would prevent any light from reaching them. This would halt their photosynthesis and effectively end their lives in due time. Thus, the pattern of growth, the anchoring rhizines, and the underlying pigmentation combine to allow Parmelia to overgrow and outcompete many lichen species that might inhabit similar environments. This, combined with a high pollution tolerance in species like Parmelia sulcata, leads to a considerable degree of overall success. Members of this genus are found throughout the world, including Antarctica. With their symbiotic nature, their capacity to simply wait out dry spells, and the various pigments acting as a bulwark to shield them from excessive sunlight, it is little wonder that lichens are able to thrive with little more than a patch of rock to grow on. It is perhaps ironic that such success has made lichens so commonplace that they are so readily and easily overlooked. A most impressive form of life, hidden away everywhere about us in plain sight. This concludes today's little foray into the unknown. For those who are still curious, here are a few things you might try looking into further. If you found this enjoyable, by all means say so. If you think others might enjoy this, by all means share. If you're interested in seeing more of this channel, a subscription should prove quite effective. Until next time.